Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daphne Guerrero. I'm the Manager of Public Education and Outreach at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. I'd just like to start off by saying thank you to the University of Ottawa and giving my kudos to the U of Ottawa and Madeleine for organizing such a fantastic event. I can speak on behalf of the OPC staff. We're finding the presentations today really insightful and really interesting and quite helpful to our day-to-day work. I'm going to start by introducing the panelists today. We're going to be talking about digital skills and education. As Patricia Cosim mentioned this morning, our commissioner is in the midst of a priority-setting exercise, and one of the themes that has come out again and again throughout this exercise is the need for more public education. So this really is a timely conversation for our office right now. First up is Karen Louise Smith. Karen Louise Smith is a MyTax Elevate postdoctoral fellow with Mozilla and the University of Toronto. Her current work explores HIVE Toronto, a Mozilla-stewarded digital literacy network and open educational infrastructures. With support from the OPC's contributions program, Dr. Smith co-designed prototypes of open privacy badges with teens from the Toronto area. Colin McKay is the head of public policy and government relations for Google in Canada. Before joining Google, he worked as the director of research and public education at the OPC. He's a member of the Government of Canada Advisory Panel on Open Government and is a member of the board of Media Smarts. And finally, Matthew Johnson is the Director of Education for Media Smarts, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. He's the designer of their digital literacy tutorials. He's contributed to blogs and articles, to websites and magazines around the world, and he's presented Media Smarts materials on topics such as copyright, cyberbullying, body image, and online hate to parents, journalists, academics, and government bodies in Canada and around the world. He's also an educator with nearly 10 years experience and is a published author of a collection of short fiction. So I'll call up Karen Louise Smith to start us off.
Good afternoon. As Daphne mentioned, I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow, and my role spans Mozilla, which is a global nonprofit committed to the open internet, and the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. I'm speaking today about a project to co-design open badges at the prototype level to engage teens to consider privacy topics. These badges were co-created with teenagers who joined the project as teen peer researchers. The badges include production-centered learning activities, such as tracing an IP address to learn its importance as personal information, and exploring 3D models of drones with camera mounts to try and understand the implications of flying cameras. The key point that I'd like to stress today is that playful approaches to privacy education that include remix and the active production of the web are necessary elements for building networked privacy. I'd like to spend a little bit of time providing some background on the project partners. HIVE Toronto is a Mozilla-stewarded digital literacy network, which is in the Greater Toronto area. We have over 60 youth-serving organizations as members, and the membership includes large national-scale organizations like the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, as well as smaller startup organizations like the Maker Kids Makerspace. The University of Toronto and the iSchool is the academic partner on the project. And as I mentioned before, 8 teen peer researchers joined the project. These teens were recruited from HIVE Toronto member organizations, and they participated in generating ideas for the badge concepts, as well as trialing the different kinds of learning activities that would be made available following the completion of the project. We began the project with the teens on a Saturday in October, and we started with a blank canvas challenge. We knew that we needed to design 10 open privacy badges at the prototype level, but we weren't sure what the concepts would be that would guide these badges and what kind of learning activities would be associated with them. And I'd like to pause and define what I mean by open badge at this point. An open badge at its simplest level is an image plus metadata. An open badge functions much like a physical badge. It's something which you earn that signifies your learning, but an open badge is a kind of open educational innovation that uses an open technical standard. And what this means is that the badge can be shared on the web, and it can live different places like a social media profile or a home page or different locations where the learner wants to display their accomplishments and skills. The components of this research project are multifaceted and still ongoing. We engaged the teen peer researchers for 70 hours of project time each, and their primary mode of participation was to attend participatory workshops, which were typically held on Saturdays for 6-hour time blocks, where they participated in brainstorming ideas, tested out learning activities, and also participated in project documentation. The teens also completed activities between workshops to prepare and scaffold for future weeks. As component of this project, my colleague Catherine Meisner and I have carried out 1-hour interviews with 12 educators from fields including public libraries, civic and legal education, and also community centers and after-school learning settings to try and get insights from educators around the badge concepts and to iterate and improve upon the curriculum. We've also carried out a 4-hour knowledge mobilization workshop, which was held this past Saturday with 30+ educators. And at this workshop, the teens led many portions of the day. They presented to the educators as well as leading them through the learning activities which they were involved in co-designing. Many people have asked me how this type of initiative fits into Mozilla as an organization, which is best known for creating the Firefox web browser. In addition to Firefox, Mozilla has a really active educational program, and it seeks to find ways to encourage people to become producers, not just consumers of the web. One open educational project which supports this is the WebMaker project. And the screenshot shows a website homepage where users are encouraged to create their own apps and websites and produce the web. The site also hosts teaching kits, which are curriculum materials which are remixable and available for reuse and remodification. And the WebMaker site is also home to some badges which are issuable, earnable, and displayable through this system. The orange screenshot shows a draft teaching kit called the Data Trail Timeline, and then the badge image is a representation of the Data Trail Timeline, which is a part of this project. Much of the surveillance studies literature, many articles in the surveillance studies literature, start with the timeline of the researcher going through their typical day and having their information collected. And we've sought to have youth carry out the same kind of journaling activity, but to turn their timelines into an audiovisual piece which they can share and discuss with their peers through this kind of production-centered learning activity. The emerging badge system, which is a part of this project, has various components. There are 3 prototypes of open badges, which we're aiming to deploy through WebMaker and which will be earnable through the site. We have 7 prototypes of other open privacy badge concepts, which are at earlier stages where the images, the metadata, and the learning activities will be in and have been developed, but where the badge won't be earnable yet on the WebMaker site. This keeps open the possibility for other organizations to implement the badges through their own systems and their own programs. The teaching kits for activities will live on the WebMaker site, and all materials will be licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 4 license, and many of the pages will include a remix button, which is a call to action for educators to adapt and modify and iterate upon the curriculum to make it useful for their contexts. I'd like to spend the remainder of my speaking time today to address some of the ways that networked privacy is facilitated through this kind of research and co-design process. The idea of production-centered learning is at the heart of many of the learning activities which are associated with the badges. There's an emphasis on having learners design, create, experiment, and explore. And activities include things like working with a biography page, where you remix it to try and strip out the personal information. Includes activities like creating your data trail timeline or tracing your IP address, and producing and creating pieces that can live on the web to share your privacy knowledge. The learning activities which we've created as a part of this project are intentionally playful. And our hope is that youth voices on privacy can be raised through fun, engaging, and playful activities. The image that I have on the screen is a paper meme. For those of you who are familiar with lolcats and jokes which circulate on the internet, we have an image here that reads, "Geodata, I know what you did last summer." And we hope that these kinds of activities will start a dialogue and spark a conversation amongst teens on privacy topics. Remix is also a foundational component of this project in both a social and a technical sense. By releasing the curriculum materials through Creative Commons licenses, as well as through a platform which has built-in affordances for Remix, there's the opportunity and possibility to break down the silos of educators. And there's the possibility that a youth who visits their public library on a Monday night and their community center on a Wednesday night may be able to carry their learnings from place to place in a way that educators can make sense of. In conclusion, I'd like to overview some points around empowerment approaches to networked privacy in relation to teens and educational materials. As other speakers have noted today, learning to control one's data is an insufficient approach to privacy education. Many teens have the primary experience of learning about privacy by being told what not to do online. Privacy learning also needs to leverage network technologies, social media, and it can involve open source software. A learning for me from being involved in this project is that open source software can offer a way to open the black box, using a science and technology studies metaphor, and to make the configurations and the reconfigurability of technology more visible to students and teen learners. Learning that takes an empowerment approach to networked privacy can involve diverse skills associated with producing the web, and learning about privacy can be intermixed with coding, remixing, and collaborating. So thank you very much, and after the other panelists, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about this project. I'd like to give a quick nod to the teen peer researchers who are part of this initiative, as well as my co-investigators and collaborators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to start, as several people have done already, by just thanking everyone who's been involved in putting this project together. It's been a real privilege today to be able to hear all of these different perspectives on privacy, and of course it's also a privilege for me to be able to share with you some of the work that we've been doing at Media Smarts. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the research that informed all of the work that we do. This is part of what's now a 15-year project called Young Canadians in a Wired World. It's the primary research project that we do, and it's dedicated to finding out what young Canadians are doing online, how they're doing it, and in particular, their attitudes and experiences towards the online world, what they're learning online, where they're learning it, and in some cases, how well they're learning it. In particular, I'm talking about our most recent iteration, Young Canadians in a Wired World Phase 3, which we've been releasing over the last year in a series of thematic reports. It's based on a survey we did in 2013, as you can see, with more than 5,000 students, with participation from every province and territory across the country. It was students in grades 4 to 11, though obviously we can sort of extrapolate backwards and forwards a little bit from that data within a few years. There are a couple of reasons why we do this research and purposes to which we put the research. One of them, of course, is to take a look at the research that's been done elsewhere in the world and to see whether it holds true in a Canadian context. And because there is very little research being done about Canadian youth and attitudes towards privacy, that's particularly important. It also allows us essentially to confirm, or in some cases not confirm, hunches that we have. So in the years between phases of this research, we increasingly have to work based on our own gut feelings, essentially on anecdotal data or on data coming from research done in other parts of the world. getting to do this research lets us confirm whether or not that's true. And finally, in some cases, it tells us when we are wrong. And in particular, it is valuable when it tells us when public attitudes and common opinion or conventional wisdom are wrong. One bit of conventional wisdom that was absolutely confirmed by our most recent round of research was that for young people, privacy is largely a social concern. What we found overwhelmingly was that for the young people, the internet and digital technology in general were used for socialization. As you can see, this is a typical grade 11 student, and the students we studied are extremely active in social media, using it primarily to communicate, using it, as you can see, somewhat more as consumers than necessarily producing themselves. But certainly, there is a lot of social activity, and as we had suspected, there was a lot of concern among young people about social privacy, about reputational privacy, about what the people they knew about them. But of course, there isn't really a hard and fast line between reputational privacy and data privacy, because most of the services that young people use for social purposes are also services that gather data about them, or that provide other people or other bodies with opportunities to gather data about them. As you can see, there are a lot of sites and services that are very popular among young people that encourage different kinds of disclosure. They encourage, obviously, what we might call social disclosure, telling people about who you are, but obviously they also encourage data disclosure. They encourage you to give up things about your demographics, about who you are. In many cases, this is a central part of their business model. And while it may be no surprise that by grade 10 and 11, almost every student in our study had a Facebook account, it was somewhat of a surprise that in grade 4, 1 in 5 students already had a Facebook account. So this was a little bit of a wake-up call for us, in that it told us that a significant number of quite young people were using social networking accounts. We also found that a significant number of young people were using virtual worlds, such as Club Penguin, Fantage, Moshi Monsters. In many cases, these also encourage the same kinds of disclosure. They collect a lot of demographic data, and again, in many cases, this is how they get around being free or free to play. We studied one of the questions we asked about was whether students were interested in data privacy. So it was no surprise to us that students were interested in reputational privacy. And we suspected, based on focus groups and other sources, that they generally tended to prefer to use social tools to control their privacy. So for instance, students who had a photo of them that they didn't like were most likely to act on that by asking to have it taken down. They generally preferred social means of controlling their privacy. But what did surprise us somewhat was that students were quite interested in data privacy, or at least in controlling their own data privacy. So as we can see on our third item here, 3/4 of the students in our survey said they wanted more control over what companies do with the photos and information that they post online. So the interest is there. At the same time, our research also confirmed for us that there's a very poor understanding of data privacy. And here's number one. 2/3 of the students said that if a website has a privacy policy, that means it will not share my personal information with others. So that line between reputational privacy and data privacy is not only blurred for young people, they really don't understand the distinction. They don't understand that essentially a privacy policy is not the same thing as the privacy settings, which our research established they're quite skilled in using. So they do understand how to use privacy settings. They've learned how to use privacy settings. They make effective use of privacy settings to control who in their social circle sees the different things that they post. But when it comes to data privacy, as you can see, a significant number of them, well over half, assume that the mere existence of a privacy policy means that their personal information is not being shared with third parties. And what was particularly surprising here was that that number is basically stable across all the grades. So students in grade 11 did not know significantly more about the meaning of a privacy policy than the students in grade 4 did. And in fact, we have at the moment a submission for the contribution program to teach high school students about terms of service and privacy policies. But right now, I'm just going to talk about this one. We see almost exactly the same ratio of students who told us that no one had ever read a privacy policy or online terms of use agreement with them. So it's clearly not a priority for parents, and we know from our work with parents that parents are worried about online safety, parents are worried about reputational privacy, but parents both are not terribly concerned in general with data privacy, unlike youth themselves. They also don't feel confident that they can teach it. We also found the same thing with teachers. It was relatively low on the list of things that teachers felt was important, and it was at the very bottom of the things that teachers felt confident teaching kids about. We see here the comparison. Only 1 in 6 students say that no one has ever taught them how to use privacy settings. So again, 40% of parents, or 40% of youth being taught by their parents how to use privacy settings. But a third of students have not learned from anyone about how companies collect and use personal information online. So this is something that kids are concerned about. It's something they need to be correct. They need to have good information about because there are powerful misconceptions, but they're not learning it. And we know, in fact, that they want to learn it. So even when we came down to what do you want to learn at school, 1 in 3, and that's our third from the top after online authentication and legality of online activities, 1 in 3 said they want to know how companies collect and use personal information. So what all of this is basically to say is to justify the approach that we take in privacy education, which is mixing reputational privacy and data privacy, teaching essentially both of them to youth whenever possible at the same time, because the division between them invariably means that kids learn just about reputational privacy, because for the adults in their lives it feels like something that they understand better, and the reasons for needing to know it are so much more immediately obvious. We all know stories. We've all read stories in the newspaper or heard stories about people who had a bad experience because something personally private came out, something that affected their reputation. Stories about the negative effects of a loss of data privacy are rarer and are frequently less emotionally compelling. But of course, we've heard already any number of examples just today of how the two overlap and how the two may be very much the same thing. So for instance, a significant number of students in our survey had done online research about mental health issues. Now that's what their search history is, a data privacy issue. We would usually define it in that way. But of course, if people know you're doing research about mental health issues, that's a reputational issue as well. And so that's why, even with the youngest students, we try to take an approach that includes both forms of privacy. When we deal with younger students, we try to do as much as we can through the form of games, and that's what I'm talking about today, of course, is our game, which I'll be showing you in a moment. So I want to pause for a second and talk about the principles that went into creating the game, because privacy, particularly data privacy, can be a difficult thing to get at, and the history of educational gaming is littered with the corpses of unsuccessful games. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of work that's been done in finding out what makes a game successful. And it boils down to a few elements, and these have been identified particularly in the work of Henry Jenkins, if you're interested in reading more about this. One of the key concerns, particularly when it comes to computer games, because there's a certain level of abstraction built into them, is what's called transfer. And transfer is basically the question of how much does what you're learning from any kind of learning activity transfer to the actual activity that you're supposed to be learning about. And how much does learning in one domain transfer to another? So there's the eternal question, for instance, about language learning. Does learning a language make you better at learning all languages? Or does it only make you better at learning related languages? Well, the answer is the latter, primarily. Although there may be other reasons why learning a language may make you feel more confident about learning other languages, especially if you do it early in life. On a strictly cognitive level, the transfer is very limited. So obviously when we're looking at computer games, this is an issue because every computer game is at best a simulation. The further apart the simulation and the actual exercise, the less transfer and the less effective the game is going to be. Our second criterion for a good educational game is that it must be possible to fail. Because if you can't fail, it's not a game. Now, that's not just a philosophical point. That actually is important when it comes to motivation. And that may seem kind of backwards. You'd think that people would be more motivated if they couldn't fail. But in fact, when failure isn't possible, you don't get invested in something. The tricky part is finding a fine line where it is possible to fail, but failure doesn't cost you too much. And that's why I have this picture of Indiana Jones up on the screen, because if you've ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, if you thought about it for about 5 minutes after seeing the movie, you would realize he fails at every single thing he does in that movie. Every single thing he attempts to do, he fails at. And yet, we don't lose respect for him. We don't think he's a loser, because he always comes back. His failures never cost him that much. He's always able to come back, and of course he wins at the end, as a result, in fact, of his failures. And so the tricky part, particularly in creating an educational game, where you've always got that sort of bitter middle of the education inside the sweet coating, the tricky part is finding the right balance between making it possible to fail, but keeping the cost of failure low, so kids don't lose heart, so they don't give up, or so that it doesn't become something they have to do. Because as soon as the game becomes something that they have to do, well, you might as well have them sitting there with worksheets. Educational games need to be integrated. Now, this is going to be tricky because we wanted to create this as something that could be used in the classroom or at home. And that's particularly important now that we're introducing these app versions, because they really are designed primarily for home use. So rather than having it as the core of a lesson, we have a brief backgrounder that shows how you can work it both into classroom practice, but also for parents, how you can make it the center of conversations about privacy. And of course, the final element of a game to be successful is it needs to be fun. And those of you who are perhaps around my age may remember educational games of the early 80s that put a very thin veneer of some kind of fantasy or science fiction onto what was essentially a rote exercise. So you were doing arithmetic drills, and if you succeeded, an alien blew up, and if you failed, an alien blew you up. There is a word for that in educational gaming, and it's called chocolate-covered broccoli. You can put all the chocolate on the broccoli that you want, it's still broccoli. So these are the challenges that we were facing. I've told you a little bit about how we met one of them. I'm going to show you the game now. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we aim to meet some of those, and obviously you can judge for yourselves. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking a little bit, particularly about why and how we created app versions thanks to our contribution funding from the Privacy Commissioner's Office. Let me go to, so here's the launch page for the game. This is the browser version of the game because we're on a laptop. Let's see if it works. Thanks.
Long ago, the map to the treasure of Internet Island was cut up into 9 pieces. Now, pirates who want your privacy have the pieces. If you can answer each pirate's question, you can put the map together and find the treasure. Before we land on the island, I'll ask you some questions about privacy. If you're not sure what the answer is, click on Hint and I'll give you some help.
So you can see immediately how we tried to address the fun issue, and also to a certain extent the transfer issue. By having a fantasy element that obviously is not a close simulation of the decisions that kids actually make about their privacy. And that's something that is very different from how we do things with older students. In the things that we've designed for older students, we have very close simulations to their actual online experiences. But for younger kids, because it's more important to make it fun, we chose this kind of fantasy element. But at the same time, most of the privacy concerns that the younger students encounter actually do happen in these contexts, because the places where young kids encounter privacy concerns are in virtual worlds and apps. And so it is probably going to be in this kind of context that they're going to be asked to give out demographic information, or that they're going to be asked to fill out a survey or what have you. A key part of the transfer in this case was to build the idea of pirates, that by setting up personal information as both something that the pirates are trying to get from the player, and also the treasure that the player is attempting to protect, it builds the key idea, which in some ways is more important than any of the individual facts in the game, that personal information, whether it be personal data or reputation, has value. And that really was the key thing that we wanted kids to take away from this, was to value their personal information. In terms of building in the possibility to fail, we have a 2-part structure. So the game begins with this mentor character, whom you just heard, and he teaches a number of basic privacy principles. So basic ideas about privacy, and as you can see, these are fairly simple questions because you only have 2 options at this point. And he's the one who, throughout the game, provides you with hints. So the mentor is this friendly character who comes with you as the game goes on, and that also gives us the opportunity to deliver the educational content on demand. So we're not just testing kids on information that they don't already have and saying, well, you didn't know it, too bad, but we're also not front-loading it. We're not saying, okay, learn all these things about privacy and then apply it. Kids learn what they need to know when they need to know it, which we know is the best way to learn. So as they go on, they encounter these different pirates. Each pirate essentially specializes in a different topic. So there's one that has questions about passwords, one with questions about photos, one with questions about surveys and contests, and so on. There's a random selection, so you can actually play through the game multiple times and get different questions, but this makes sure that all of the different areas are covered. So they ask you a question. These are the questions, and as you can see at this point, there's now 3 questions to choose from, so it's a little bit harder, and we have access to the mentor as someone who can help us out. And the way that we built failure into the game while keeping the cost of failure low was simply, there's a limited number of questions. There are 9 questions, and once you get enough wrong that you can't pass the game, that you can't reach a passing score, you're sent back to the tutorial. So the mentor basically says, I think you need to learn a little bit more about privacy and personal information. Let's cover the basics again. So there's a very low cost to failure because you're just sent back to the training. It allows the player to be refreshed on those key concepts, and then they just come right back to it. And again, the random selection of questions means they won't necessarily get the same questions they did the first time through. And of course, we have here, as a motivator, something you collect. That's something that we know motivates kids a lot, the idea of building towards something. And so in this case, it's a treasure map. Every time you get a question right, you get another piece of the treasure map. And finally, this is what you get at the end if you're able to collect all of the different pieces. And you get, at the end, you found the treasure, and you're told that the treasure is actually your personal information, which you need to keep safe. So what we've done this year is creating an app version. We've done this made it for iOS and Android. And I mentioned earlier about how we use our research to inform our work. One of the things that our research told us that didn't surprise us was that young people, particularly the youngest kids, are enthusiastic users of mobile devices. That mobile devices have really become, again, especially among younger kids, one of the most popular ways of accessing the internet. And so making it available through mobile devices is a really important way of getting this education to the kids that need it in the same space where they're going to be encountering these privacy concerns. But our research, as I also said, sometimes surprises us. And one of the things that surprised us about our most recent research, which we actually haven't published yet, is that tablets are also very popular in the classroom. We found that more than half of teachers in our recent survey of 5,000 teachers across Canada have tablets available to use in the classroom, and that also more than half of teachers allow their students to bring in their own tablets as part of Bring Your Own Device programs. And again, that shows us that the app versions are essential not only to get this resource into households, but also into classrooms. And that's how we've integrated both data and reputation privacy into education for kids 5 to 7. Thank you.
It feels like old home week. I was saying to Pat that the first week I joined the office 8 years ago, the Pathways to Privacy Forum, I think, was either in this room or in the rotunda out there. And if Francois was in the room, he can confirm that. When I was first asked if I could participate in this panel, I was excited because I knew our product plans, and I knew that something might be coming out this week, which I'll discuss in a couple of minutes, something called YouTube Kids, and there he is. So was it in here or was it outside? You know, it wasn't here, yeah. No, okay, you're right, it was a different research symposium, sorry. Inside talk already. As I was thinking through what I wanted to speak with you today, I was thinking through behaviors and habits, which both Karen and Matthew talked about, and the way they're evolving. We released an interesting piece of research this week where we had our DeepMind computers tackle the fundamental problems, as Matthew alluded to, of early 1980s video games. trying to tackle the challenge of learning digital literacy by a machine on very simple outcomes. And I was kind of happy and proud that our extremely sophisticated computers managed to master all of the Atari 2600 OOV. So those of us who spend thousands of hours mastering asteroids and Galaga can just feel all that less consequential in life. But it's an interesting observation, and it comes back to the point that there's an evolution in understanding the tools, there's an evolution in understanding the devices and the tasks you're tackling, and it involves incredible investment in time. And that's obviously something that we set our minds to with artificial intelligence and DeepMind, simply to demonstrate that this device could accomplish the similar level of achievement as a 12-year-old boy with a pocket full of quarters. But that's the same behavior that when I first started working in the office and now that I work at Google, I've seen as well, which is, and as we've been discussing on this panel and likely all day, you hand someone a device and then you pretty much let them loose to figure out how to adapt their behaviors and adopt social norms around its use, and then trust to the parents and the teachers and the community to provide them guidance and signals on what is appropriate use based on social norms, based on your family's values, based on the values you'd like your child to adopt. And that prompted me to think of a conversation I had with my brother. He and I are separated by 2 years, but our children are separated by 20. So one weekend he texted me and he said, we left Jack, their young boy, with my friend for the weekend, and now he's learned how to swipe, and he was 2. And I could tell that Jack had learned how to swipe because Andrew's Facebook feed was full of pictures of thumbs and feet and the dog and outside. And for me, that was an interesting transition point for my brother, because he obviously had been trying to apply a technique of control and shutdown, and avoiding having that conversation, obviously with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. But the allure of the tool and the allure of the content was great enough that he somehow got a hold of an iPhone and figured it out while being babysat. There's a separate conversation there about the existing relationship between my brother and the friend who babysat his son, because obviously there's a bit of a rift now. And this is some of the insight that's come into when we as a company look at behavior online, when families and individuals of any age are using our tools. And by tools, I mean services, and principally in the conversation we're having on our panel, I'm thinking of YouTube. And we can see through our usage logs the sort of behavior that takes place and on what devices, as Matthew was referring to, just referencing at the end of his presentation, this focus on mobile, whether it's a phone or whether it's a tablet, and the sort of content that's being accessed on which devices. And if you do a rough survey of any parent, they're trying to moderate their kids' use of online tools, and they're trying to moderate their kids' use of devices themselves, and trying to apply controls to that activity in a sort of ersatz way. Like whether it's a watch to monitor the time that you're spending online, or physically turning off the router after a specific time, or as in my case with my 14-year-old, just surprising him every hour and a half just to look at what he's doing on all his devices. There's ways of intervening, there's ways of reinforcing those social norms. And as a company and as a subunit in YouTube, we realized that there's a specific set of behaviors around YouTube that are quite explicit, but also very useful. And those are around when you want to share specific content with one of your children, and you want to make sure that it's child-specific and it's focused and it's useful, and that it reinforces positive behaviors. And it does that in a way that's still controllable by you as a parent or an authority figure. And our YouTube team dug into how to develop an app called YouTube Kids, which we launched on Monday. And it's only available in the US right now. But the idea behind YouTube Kids is there's sufficient content on YouTube from traditional sources that we rely upon, that we've all grown up with, or that we're discovering as they move on to online platforms and expand their breadth and their reach. I, for one, am really impressed by what Sesame Street is doing with their digital channels. It allows me to maintain the addiction to short spurts of entertainment that they first burned into my skull with Electric Company in 1977. And what YouTube Kids does is it presents an app that's available for children to use, but is set up by parents. And it's logged out. So you're not using YouTube in any context where it's associated with an individual or the family or particular elements about the user. It's simply saying, we're going to apply a filter to your YouTube experience that gives you, as the authority figure, the ability to say, this is a child-safe environment with reliable content from trusted producers that my child will find appealing, and that will provide them with entertainment within a context that I'm secure with. And importantly, it has a timer on it. So you can set the timer so the device will shut off while they're using it after a specific amount of time. And the goal really is to try and address some of the challenges we've been speaking to, which is when you're talking about user experience online, and you're talking about signaling about the extent to which you're interacting with a service and the extent to which you're exchanging personal information in the course of using a service, how do you develop a tool that it has very clear-cut signaling for the user and for the community around that user that's trying to educate, inform them, and build good habits? And then how do you try and, as Matthew kept repeating, how do you try and reinforce, because you have to, reinforce good behavior? You know, how do you create an environment where they see clear signals that there's acceptable use of this product, this service, this tool, within conditions that are shared or imposed by the authority figure in the family? So YouTube Kids it's an attempt to try and address that need for a very specific reason and a very specific goal. And importantly, there's still an element of discovery to it. So YouTube Kids still uses the discovery element of YouTube, which of course has many reliable channels from standard producers, creators, and traditional broadcasters, but also has a lot of user-generated content that is highly relevant to what children are interested in. I was saying to Daphne, she was mentioning Star Wars fascination by toddlers. And I, of course, said, have you seen the Lego Star Wars? You know, and her reply was, which one? Because YouTube is full of people that are recreating every movie based with Lego. The search mechanism in YouTube Kids is designed to surface that material that's both acceptable and context relevant for the child that's using the app. As I said, once again, within the limitations that are set for the app's use and providing some level of comfort for the parent themselves. We were talking also, Karen was speaking about user badges and broader-based signaling of privacy. And, you know, I'll just be honest with you, as a representative of Google, that is a very tough nut to crack. It's an ongoing discussion in the context of privacy legislation in Europe and in North America. And it's been an ongoing discussion in the DPA community since Ann Kavoukian first proposed layered notices. We're still trying to tackle with the idea of layered notices, whether it's through badges or whether it's through actual structured notices and menus on mobile devices. What exactly is the appropriate way to communicate permission settings and to communicate how data is being collected and how it's being used, and negotiate that relationship between the user and the service provider, which is especially difficult as we discuss the multiplicity of devices that we're using on a daily basis. You know, small phone, big phone, computer, desktop, portable, tablet. Those are all shifting design models that require a different level of insight, a different level of presentation, and sometimes different assumptions on the part of the user. Tablets are largely used for content, while phones are largely used for communication. How do you bridge the gap in understanding permissions and understanding the definition of consent between those two devices? And it's a place where I think, and I've argued this for a few years, we're still in a great process of transition. If we look at the phones and the mobile devices we had 5 years ago and how we understood our relationship with developers and service providers online versus the ability to access information and to examine the depth, or rather layers, of our relationship with a service provider today, there's been a tremendous leap forward. But as Matthew was hinting, there's still such a level of complexity that it almost becomes a state of confusion, because it is moving at a rate that's seemingly, for a person who's 45, much easier to understand and adapt to as a teenager and as a young man than it is someone who's spent their formative years dealing with text-only video games. But I think it's a space, as Karen is researching this full time and trying to execute on a strategy that tries to grapple with user interaction, simple design processes, and a very complex idea. It's a place where whether it's Mozilla, Google, any of the companies that are operating online, are investing a tremendous amount of time and resources trying to get it right. Because in the end, the key is to make sure that the user has a satisfactory and reassuring experience, and that we're minimizing confusion and doubt about the transaction and the service that they've entered into. It's still a long-term challenge, though. And with that, I'll close.